Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you're watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. There exists a moment, fleeting yet profound, when you catch yourself thinking about thinking. Perhaps it happens late at night when sleep eludes you, or during a quiet walk when your mind wanders inward. In that instant, you become aware of your own awareness, conscious of consciousness itself. And in that very moment, something strange occurs. The observer and the observed collapse into one another, creating a hall of mirrors where each reflection contains another reflection, stretching into infinity. This is not merely an abstract puzzle for philosophers to ponder over wine and argument. This is the fundamental mystery at the heart of human existence, the paradox of knowing yourself completely. Tonight, as darkness settles and the world grows quiet, we embark on a journey into this mystery. We will walk alongside ancient Greek thinkers who stood before temple walls inscribed with commands they could never fully obey. We will sit with medieval scholars wrestling with the nature of consciousness. We will listen to Buddhist monks who discovered liberation in the most counterintuitive revelation imaginable. And we will peer into modern laboratories where scientists watch the brain watching itself, discovering that the self might be the most elaborate story ever told. The question seems simple enough. Can you truly know yourself? Can you achieve complete, total, perfect self-knowledge? But simplicity dissolves the moment we look closer. Every answer spawns new questions. Each certainty reveals deeper uncertainty. The pursuit of self-knowledge, we will discover, is like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror, like attempting to bite your own teeth, like asking a finger to point at itself. The very act of trying transforms what we're trying to know. Consider for a moment what it would mean to know yourself completely. You would need to know every thought that crosses your mind, every emotion that wells up from depths you cannot name, every motivation that drives your actions, every memory stored in the intricate networks of your brain, every unconscious process operating beneath awareness, every potential version of yourself that might emerge under different circumstances. You would need to know not just who you are now, but who you were, who you're becoming, and perhaps even who you might have been. You would need to know the knower itself, the very awareness that knows all these things. And here the paradox reveals its first terrible beauty. To know the knower, you would need another knower standing behind it, observing it. And to know that knower, another and another, in an infinite regression of consciousness, examining consciousness. This is not simply an intellectual exercise designed to pass the time. The stakes could not be higher. For millennia, humans have been told that self-knowledge is the path to wisdom, to virtue, to salvation itself. Know thyself commands the ancient inscription, as if our very humanity depends on achieving this knowledge. Yet, what if the command points towards something impossible? What if the pursuit itself is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what we are? What if there is, in fact, no stable self to know? As you settle deeper into rest tonight, allow yourself to hold these questions lightly. We are not seeking answers that close doors, but understandings that open new passages into mystery. The paradox of self-knowledge has captivated the greatest minds across cultures and centuries, not because it can be solved, but because wrestling with it transforms us. In the struggle to know ourselves, we discover something far more profound than knowledge. We discover the inexhaustible depth of human existence, the beautiful impossibility of consciousness turning back upon itself, the strange loop at the core of what it means to be aware. Tonight's exploration will take us through philosophical traditions separated by thousands of miles and years, yet united by their confrontation with this same essential mystery. From ancient Athens to Buddhist monasteries, from Descartes' fireplace to modern neuroscience laboratories, humans have discovered and rediscovered that the self is not what it seems. The journey ahead is not a straight path toward clarity, but a spiraling descent into increasingly subtle paradoxes, each one revealing new dimensions of the impossibility we've been chasing. The ancient Greeks, with their love of wisdom and their talent for asking questions that have no easy answers, recognize something that modern culture often forgets. The command to know yourself was inscribed on a temple wall, precisely because it was impossibly difficult, perhaps even impossible. It was not a simple instruction like wash your hands or honor your parents. It was a koan before Buddhism invented koans, a puzzle designed to break the mind's usual ways of grasping at certainty. The more deeply the ancient philosophers examined themselves, the more elusive the self became. Socrates, perhaps the wisest of them all, concluded that his wisdom consisted precisely in knowing that he knew nothing. This was not modesty, but metaphysical revelation. The paradox deepens the more we examine it. If you could somehow achieve complete self-knowledge, you would need to know that you have achieved it. But how would you know that you know? You would need to know your knowledge of your knowledge, which requires knowing your knowledge of your knowledge of your knowledge, spiraling upward in an infinite tower of meta-awareness. The certainty you seek keeps receding like the horizon, always visible, never reachable. And even if you could somehow grasp this infinite chain of knowing, you would face another problem. By the time you've completed the knowing, you've already changed. The self you finally understood has already become someone else. This is the mystery we'll explore tonight. Not to solve it, but to dwell within it, to let its impossibility teach us something about the strange gift of consciousness. As your breathing slows and your thoughts begin their nightly drift toward dissolution, let yourself wonder, what if the inability to know yourself completely is not a failure, but a feature? What if the mystery at your core is what makes you human? What if consciousness itself requires a blind spot at its center, a place where seeing cannot reach, where the eye cannot turn back upon itself? The journey into self-knowledge is simultaneously a journey into self-ignorance. Every step forward in understanding reveals new territories of not knowing. This is not cause for despair, but for wonder. Tonight, as we trace this paradox through history and across cultures, we discover that generations of brilliant minds have stood exactly where you stand now, gazing into the same abyss, marveling at the same impossibility. You are not alone in your confusion. You are part of humanity's oldest conversation, the one we've been having with ourselves since we first became aware that we were aware. Let us begin where so many journeys of Western philosophy begin, in ancient Greece, where a temple inscription posed a challenge that echoes still through the corridors of human thought. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi stood on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, a place where earth met sky, where humans sought divine. Pilgrims travelled from across the Mediterranean world to consult the oracle, seeking knowledge of their futures, guidance for their troubles, answers to questions they could not solve alone. But before entering the inner sanctum where the Pythia delivered her cryptic prophecies, visitors encountered words carved into stone. Know thyself. Not a suggestion, but a command. Not helpful advice, but an impossible demand. The origins of this maxim are lost to time, buried beneath layers of legend and competing claims. Some attributed it to Apollo himself, the god of light and knowledge. Others credited various wise men. though no consensus emerged about which sage first spoke these words. This uncertainty itself holds meaning. The injunction to know yourself emerged from a place of mystery, offered by unknown voices, as if the very command carried within it the seed of its own impossibility. How fitting that the origins of the call to self-knowledge should themselves be unknown. Socrates, wandering the streets of Athens in the 5th century before the Common Era, took this command as his life's work. Yet his approach to self-knowledge was profoundly paradoxical from the start. He claimed to know nothing, to be ignorant, to possess no wisdom. When the oracle at Delphi declared that no one was wiser than Socrates, he was puzzled. He knew he wasn't wise. He knew nothing. So he set out to find someone wiser than himself, someone who truly possessed knowledge. He questioned politicians, poets, craftsmen, anyone with a reputation for wisdom. And he discovered something remarkable. Everyone else thought they knew things they didn't actually know. They possessed false certainty, unearned confidence, the dangerous delusion of understanding. Here emerges the first great paradox of self-knowledge. The wisest person is the one who knows they don't know. Socrates was wise precisely because he recognized his ignorance. Everyone else was doubly ignorant because they were ignorant of their own ignorance. They didn't know, but they thought they did, which made them incapable of learning. True self-knowledge, Socrates suggested, begins not with discovering what you are, but with discovering what you are not. It starts not with accumulating facts about yourself, but with demolishing false certainties. This negative approach to self-knowledge runs counter to our intuitions. We want to build up a picture of ourselves, to add detail and color, until we have a complete portrait. But Socrates suggests we must first tear down the false images we've constructed. We must strip away the personas, the social roles, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Only when we've cleared away all the false identifications can we perhaps glimpse something true. But what remains after this demolition? Socrates himself seemed uncertain. In the dialogue called Phaedrus, he confesses, "I am not yet able, as the Delphic inscription has it, to know myself." Even Socrates, the paragon of self-examination, the one who spent his entire life pursuing self-knowledge, admitted he had not achieved it. The Socratic method, that famous technique of questioning that reveals contradictions and exposes hidden assumptions, was not merely a tool for teaching others. It was a practice of self-examination, a way of holding up a mirror to the soul. But what Socrates discovered was that the mirror never quite captures what it reflects. Each answer spawned new questions. Each apparent certainty dissolved under closer inspection. The examined life, he insisted, is the only life worth living. Yet examination reveals primarily how little we understand about ourselves. Consider the dialogues where Socrates attempts to define virtues like courage, justice, or temperance. His interlocutors offer definitions that seem clear at first. Courage is standing your ground in battle. Justice is giving each person what they're owed. Temperance is self-control. But Socrates asks questions that reveal how these definitions fail, how they lead to contradictions, how they don't actually capture the essence of what we're trying to define. The same process applies to self-knowledge. We think we know what we mean when we say I. We think we understand what it means to be ourselves. But under Socratic questioning, this certainty evaporates. Am I my body? That decays and changes. Am I my mind? That shifts and transforms. Am I my soul? What even is that? The ancient Greeks recognized that self-knowledge was bound up with moral knowledge. To know yourself was to know how to live. The command wasn't simply about achieving an abstract understanding, but about becoming a certain kind of person. You needed to know yourself in order to live virtuously, to make wise choices, to fulfill your purpose. Yet this connection between self-knowledge and ethics actually deepens the paradox. If you need self-knowledge to live well, but you can't achieve complete self-knowledge, then living well becomes impossible. Unless perhaps the pursuit itself is what matters. Unless the constant examination, the perpetual questioning, the refusal to accept easy answers about who you are constitutes the ethical life. Socrates paid the ultimate price for his commitment to self-examination and the examination of others. Athens sentenced him to death for corrupting the youth, for questioning accepted beliefs, for making people uncomfortable with his relentless inquiry. He could have escaped, could have fled into exile, but he chose to drink the hemlock, to die rather than abandon his philosophical mission. In his final hours, he continued discussing the nature of the soul with his friends, still questioning, still examining, still pursuing the self-knowledge that had eluded him his entire life. His death was his final lesson. The examined life matters more than life itself. But Socrates left behind a troubling legacy. If the wisest person knows they know nothing, including knowing nothing about themselves, then what hope do the rest of us have? If Socrates, who devoted every waking hour to self-examination, who made it his life's purpose, who sacrificed everything for the pursuit of wisdom, couldn't achieve self-knowledge, then is it achievable at all? Or is the Delphic command a cruel joke, asking us to do something impossible, setting us up for inevitable failure? The ancient Greeks also recognized something else about self-knowledge. You can't achieve it alone. The self is not a private internal entity that can be examined in isolation. Plato, Socrates' student, suggested that you need others to truly see yourself. Just as an eye cannot see itself directly, but needs to look into another eye to catch its own reflection, the soul needs other souls to witness itself. Self-knowledge requires dialogue, conversation, the mirror that other people provide. But this creates another paradox. If you can only know yourself through others, then your self-knowledge depends on their perceptions, which may be flawed or distorted. You're trying to see yourself through eyes that may not see clearly. The warning inscribed alongside "Know thyself" at Delphi was equally important. Nothing in excess. These two commands were intimately related. The pursuit of self-knowledge could itself become excessive, obsessive, destructive. You could become so focused on examining yourself that you lose the ability to live. The introspection could spiral into rumination, the self-examination into self-absorption. The Greeks understood that the paradox had a dangerous edge. The more you look inward, the more distorted your vision becomes. The eye turned back upon itself sees nothing but its own seeing. As Athens gave way to Rome, as centuries passed and new empires rose and fell, the command to know yourself echoed through the ages. But no one found a way to fully obey it. Philosophers refined their understanding of the paradox, added new dimensions to the problem, developed more sophisticated arguments. But the fundamental mystery remained. Consciousness trying to grasp itself is like a hand trying to grasp itself, like a knife trying to cut itself, like fire trying to burn itself. The very act seems impossible, yet we cannot stop attempting it. The ancient insight, then, was not a solution but a recognition of the problem. Self-knowledge is necessary but impossible, essential but unachievable, the foundation of wisdom yet forever elusive. This is not a failure of ancient philosophy, but its greatest achievement, honestly confronting a paradox without pretending it can be easily resolved. The Greeks had the courage to ask questions they couldn't answer and the wisdom to keep asking despite knowing no answer would come. As you drift deeper towards sleep, hold this ancient paradox lightly in your mind. The wisest person knows they know nothing, including knowing nothing about themselves. Yet the pursuit of self-knowledge remains the highest calling. Tomorrow, you will wake and continue your own journey of self-examination, knowing as Socrates knew that the goal recedes even as you approach it. The command remains inscribed in stone, impossible yet unavoidable. Know thyself. But there's another dimension to this paradox that the ancient Greeks only glimpsed, one that modern thinkers would articulate more clearly. The very act of self-observation changes what's being observed. When you turn your attention inward, you alter the inner landscape. This is not merely a practical problem that better techniques might solve. It's fundamental to the structure of consciousness itself. Imagine trying to catch a thought in the act of arising. The moment you notice it, it's already transformed. It's no longer a spontaneous thought, but an observed thought, a thought being thought about. The observation intrudes, creates distance, changes the relationship between you and your experience. Who is the you that observes? Who is the you being observed? Are they the same? If they're the same, how can one watch the other? If they're different, which one is really you? This is the observer's dilemma, a puzzle that has haunted philosophers for millennia, but that takes on new urgency in the modern age. When we speak of self-knowledge, we assume there's a self to be known and a knower capable of knowing it. But these two aspects of ourselves refuse to stay separate. The observer and the observed collapse into each other, creating what modern theorists call a strange loop, a system that contains a representation of itself that folds back upon itself in an impossible way. Every time you try to observe your own mind, you're using your mind to do the observing. You're employing the very instrument you're trying to examine. It's like trying to see your own eyes directly without any mirror or reflection. You can see everything else, but you cannot see the seeing itself. You can think about your thoughts, but you cannot think about the thinking that's doing the thinking about the thinking, except by adding yet another layer of thinking, which itself escapes direct observation. The psychologist William James described consciousness as a stream, a continuous flow that cannot be divided into discrete moments without destroying its essential nature. When you try to examine your own consciousness, you're trying to step outside the stream, to observe it from the bank. But you cannot step outside. You are the stream. Any observation you make is itself part of the flow, changing its course even as you watch. The observer is swimming in what they're trying to observe, immersed in it, constituted by it, impossible to separate from it. Modern psychology has documented what's called the observer effect in quantum physics and applied it to consciousness. The act of observing changes what's being observed. In the quantum realm, this happens because measurement requires interaction, and any interaction disturbs the system. In consciousness, it happens because observation is itself a mental act that becomes part of the mental landscape being observed. When you notice you're anxious, the noticing changes the anxiety. When you observe yourself thinking, the observation becomes part of the thought. When you try to catch yourself in a particular mood, the very act of catching shifts the mood. This creates an infinite regress that's dizzying to contemplate. If you're observing yourself, then who's observing the observer who's observing the observer? You can always ask about the next level up. The watcher watches the watcher watching the watcher watching the watcher in an endless series that never reaches a final observer, a pure subject that isn't itself an object for some higher observer. It's mirrors reflecting mirrors, consciousness folding back upon itself infinitely. Some philosophers have suggested that consciousness requires this blind spot at its center. Just as your eye has a blind spot where the optic nerve connects to the retina, consciousness has a blind spot where it cannot see itself seeing. This isn't a defect to be corrected, but an essential feature. For consciousness to function, for experience to happen, there must be a place where the loop doesn't close, where seeing doesn't see itself seeing, where a gap remains. If consciousness could truly observe itself completely, the loop would close and the system would collapse. The observer and observed would become identical, which means neither would exist as separate entities, which means observation itself would become impossible. There's also what modern psychology calls the self-absorption paradox. People who are highly self-conscious, who constantly monitor and evaluate themselves, often have worse self-knowledge than those who are less introspective. Too much focus on the self can actually distort self-understanding. When you're always watching yourself, you become like an actor performing for an audience, and the performance replaces the authentic experience. You lose touch with spontaneous feeling and genuine motivation. The examined life, taken to an extreme, becomes a life of constant performance, where nothing is simply experienced, but everything is filtered through the lens of self-observation. Research has shown that there are different types of self-reflection, and they have very different effects. Contemplative self-reflection, where you curiously examine your experiences without judgment, can lead to greater wisdom and well-being. Ruminative self-reflection, where you obsessively circle the same thoughts and problems, leads to anxiety and depression. The former is a mirror that clarifies. The latter is a hall of mirrors that distorts. But how do you know which type you're engaged in while you're doing it? The moment you ask yourself whether you're ruminating, you're observing your reflection, which may itself be either contemplative or ruminative, creating another layer of potential distortion. The paradox deepens when we consider that consciousness is not a unified thing. Modern neuroscience reveals that the brain consists of multiple systems that often work at cross purposes, that compete for control, that operate according to different principles. The self we think we're observing is actually a confederation of processes, a committee without a chairman, a chorus without a conductor. When you try to observe yourself, which part is doing the observing? Which part is being observed? The answer isn't clear because there is no single you to do the observing. The observer is itself multiple, shifting, contextual. Split-brain patients demonstrate this unnervingly. When the corpus callosum connecting the brain's hemispheres is severed, the two hemispheres can have different beliefs, different perceptions, different intentions. Experimenters can show images to just one hemisphere and elicit responses that the other hemisphere genuinely doesn't know about. Yet each hemisphere maintains a sense of being a unified self. The left hemisphere, in particular, acts as an interpreter, creating narratives to explain behaviors whose causes it doesn't actually know. When the right hemisphere sees an image and causes the person to pick up a shovel, the left hemisphere confabulates a reason. Oh, I picked up the shovel because I'm going to clean the barn. The interpreter didn't actually know why the hand reached for the shovel, but it immediately created a story. This interpreter operates in all of us, not just split-brain patients. It's constantly creating narratives about why we do what we do, feel what we feel, think what we think. But these narratives are often fictional. We have remarkably poor access to the actual causes of our behavior. When asked why we chose one product over another, one candidate over another, one partner over another, We generate plausible-sounding reasons, but psychological research consistently shows that these reasons are often wrong. The real causes operate unconsciously, below the threshold of awareness, in systems that don't report to the conscious narrator. So when you try to achieve self-knowledge, when you examine your motivations and beliefs and desires, you're not accessing the actual mechanisms of your mind. You're listening to a narrator who's making up stories, a public relations department that creates coherent accounts after the fact. The narrator is persuasive because it's good at its job, but it's not reporting the truth. It's constructing a plausible fiction, a story that makes sense of behaviors whose real causes remain hidden. The observer's dilemma, then, is not just about the logical impossibility of consciousness observing itself. It's about the fundamental unreliability of introspection. Even when we successfully turn our attention inward, what we see is not the machinery of consciousness, but a carefully curated display, a stage show put on for our benefit. The backstage remains dark, inaccessible, unknown. The workers operating the lights and pulling the ropes stay hidden behind the curtain. This should be humbling. We are strangers to ourselves in ways we don't suspect. The very tool we use to know ourselves is the thing that most effectively hides the truth from us. The narrator tells such convincing stories that we believe them without question. We think we know why we feel angry or anxious or joyful, why we made this choice or that choice, what we truly value and desire. But we're often wrong. We're listening to a storyteller who creates fiction and presents it as fact, yet we cannot stop trying to know ourselves. The drive is too strong, the need too essential. Even knowing that complete self-knowledge is impossible, even recognizing all the ways introspection misleads us, we cannot help but turn inward, asking who we are, trying to understand ourselves. The paradox becomes existential. We must pursue what we cannot achieve, must seek what cannot be found, must try to observe what changes in the very act of observation. As you settle deeper into the threshold between waking and sleep, notice how your awareness shifts. In waking consciousness, there's a strong sense of being an observer, a witness to your thoughts and perceptions. But as sleep approaches, this observer begins to dissolve. Thoughts arise without anyone claiming to think them. Awareness continues without anyone claiming to be aware. The boundary between observer and observed blurs and finally disappears. Perhaps this dissolution offers its own strange lesson about the observer's dilemma. Perhaps the problem only exists when we insist on maintaining the separation between watcher and watched. Perhaps in letting go of the need to observe, we discover a different kind of knowing. The question remains suspended as consciousness fades. Who watches when the watcher disappears? In the winter of 1619, a young French mathematician sat alone in a small heated room in Bavaria, seeking shelter from the cold and from the chaos of Europe's religious wars. René Descartes had already achieved recognition for his mathematical innovations, but he was seeking something more fundamental, a foundation for all knowledge, a single certainty upon which an entire system of truth could be built. And in that room, through a method of radical doubt that would revolutionize Western philosophy, he discovered what he believed was that foundation. Descartes' method was to doubt everything that could possibly be doubted. If even the slightest reason for doubt existed, he would set aside that belief as uncertain. He doubted his senses, since they sometimes deceived him. He doubted the existence of the physical world, since dreams can feel entirely real while we're in them. He even doubted mathematical truths, imagining an evil demon who might be deceiving him about the simplest calculations, making him think that 2 plus 2 equals 4, when it might equal 5. He pushed doubt to its absolute limit, questioning every belief he had ever held. But then he discovered something he could not doubt. He could doubt his senses, doubt his body, doubt the external world, doubt mathematics itself. But there was one thing he could not doubt. He was thinking. Even if he doubted everything else, the very act of doubting was itself a form of thinking. And if he was thinking, then he must exist. Something must exist to do the thinking. The thought could not exist without a thinker. From this insight came the famous dictum, "I think, therefore I am." This seems like a triumph for self-knowledge. At last, something about the self that's certain beyond all doubt. The self exists. The I is not an illusion, not a fiction, not a convenient story. It's the one thing we can know with absolute certainty. The cogito, as this argument came to be called, appears to solve the problem of self-knowledge by providing a foundation, an indubitable starting point from which other truths can be derived. But Descartes immediately recognized that this certainty was narrower than it first appeared. Yes, he knew that he existed. But what was he? What was this I that thought, this self whose existence could not be doubted? He wrote, "I do not yet know with sufficient clearness what I am, though assured that I am." He knew that he existed, but he did not know what he was. He possessed knowledge of existence, but not knowledge of essence. Here, the paradox of self-knowledge takes a new form. You can be certain you exist, but that certainty tells you almost nothing about who or what you are. The I in "I think, therefore I am" is almost empty, a bare point of awareness that carries no content. Descartes concluded that he was a thinking thing, a mind. But how did he know this? How could he be sure that thinking wasn't just one of many attributes he possessed, or that he wasn't fundamentally something else entirely? He reasoned that he could doubt the existence of his body, but not the existence of his mind. Therefore, he concluded, he was essentially a mind, and his body was secondary, perhaps even separable. This mind-body dualism would haunt philosophy for centuries, creating as many problems as it solved. But for our purposes, what matters is the gap between knowing that you exist and knowing what you are. The cogito gives you the former, but not the latter. And without knowing what you are, can you really claim to know yourself? Think about what Descartes achieved and what he didn't achieve. He proved to his satisfaction that he existed. But the self whose existence he proved was a remarkably thin thing. It's the bare fact of thinking, the logical necessity that thoughts require a thinker. It tells you nothing about your character, your memories, your personality, your body, your emotions, your desires, your unconscious motivations, your relationships, your place in the world. All of these remain uncertain, subject to doubt. The cogito proves that there is a self, but it leaves almost everything about that self unknown. Moreover, Descartes made a controversial assumption that many later philosophers questioned, that thinking requires a thinker, that thoughts cannot exist without a self to think them. This seems obvious at first glance, but what if thoughts simply arise, like clouds forming in the sky, without any substantial self behind them? What if the sense of being a thinker is itself just another thought, one that arises along with all the others? Then the cogito would prove only that thinking exists, not that a thinker exists. The I might be an illusion created by the flow of thoughts themselves. David Hume would later search for this self through introspection and report that he could never find it. Whenever he looked within, he found particular thoughts, sensations, emotions. But he never found a self having these experiences, only the experiences themselves. The self seemed to be nothing more than a bundle of perceptions, with no substantial entity tying them together. If Hume was right, then Descartes' certain knowledge of the self's existence was an illusion, a grammatical necessity mistaken for a metaphysical truth. We say "I think" because that's how language works, not because there really is an I doing the thinking. Even if we grant Descartes his conclusion that he exists as a thinking self, we face another problem. What kind of access does the self have to itself? Descartes believed that the mind is transparent to itself, that we have direct, privileged access to our own thoughts and mental states. If I think I'm in pain, I really am in pain. If I think I believe something, I really do believe it. The contents of my mind are immediately available to me in a way they're not available to anyone else. But this transparency assumption has been thoroughly challenged by modern psychology. We've already discussed how much of our mental life operates unconsciously, below the threshold of awareness. We've seen how the brain's left hemisphere creates narratives about behaviors whose real causes it doesn't know. The mind is not transparent to itself. It's more like a house with many locked rooms, where the resident has access to only a few brightly lit parlors, while the rest remains in darkness. Descartes may have been certain he was thinking, but he had no special access to what was really going on in his mind. Consider self-deception, a phenomenon that shows how opaque we can be to ourselves. Someone might genuinely believe they're not jealous while exhibiting all the behaviors of jealousy. They might sincerely claim to be happy while showing every sign of depression. They might honestly think they're motivated by principle while actually acting from self-interest. The self-deception isn't deliberate lying. It's a genuine failure of self-knowledge, a case where what we consciously believe about ourselves contradicts the truth about our mental states. How is self-deception even possible if we have transparent access to our minds? If I know all my mental states directly, how can I deceive myself about them? The answer seems to be that the mind is not unified, not transparent, not fully accessible to itself. Different systems operate with different information, different goals, different representations. What one part knows, another part may not know. What one part believes, another part may deny. The self observing itself may not see what's really there, even when it's looking directly at its own experiences. Descartes also discovered something troubling when he tried to build further knowledge upon the foundation of the cogito. He realized that his certainty about his own existence didn't extend to certainty about anything else. He could be sure he was thinking, but he couldn't be sure about the content of his thoughts. He might think he sees a table, but how does he know there really is a table, rather than a dream or a deception? He needed to prove God's existence and benevolence to guarantee that his clear and distinct perceptions were reliable. But to prove God's existence, he needed to trust his reasoning. And to trust his reasoning, he needed God to guarantee it wasn't deceived. This circular problem, known as the Cartesian circle, shows how quickly certainty evaporates even after the cogito. So Descartes gives us a paradox that's even more specific than Socrates. You can be absolutely certain that you exist, but that certainty is almost useless. You know that you are, but not what you are. You know you're thinking, but not the nature of the self that thinks. You have access to your thoughts, but that access is neither complete nor reliable. The one point of absolute certainty turns out to be a vanishingly small island in an ocean of uncertainty. This raises a question Descartes never adequately answered. What exactly is the I that thinks? Is it a substance, a soul, an immaterial mind? Or is it just a grammatical necessity, a way of organizing our experience into subject and predicate. When you say, I think, are you reporting a real entity, or are you just following linguistic convention? The certainty of the cogito might be nothing more than the certainty of correct grammar. There's also a temporal problem Descartes didn't fully address. The cogito proves that you exist in the moment of thinking it. But does it prove you exist at other times? Does it prove that the I that existed a moment ago is the same I that exists now? You might be a series of momentary selves, each one distinct, with no continuous identity linking them together. The certainty of existence might last only as long as each individual thought, vanishing and reappearing moment by moment. You would exist intermittently, like a light that flickers on and off, certain of each illuminated moment, but with no guarantee of continuity between them. Philosophers have debated these questions for centuries without reaching consensus. Some defend Descartes, arguing that the cogito provides exactly the foundation he claimed. Others criticize it from every angle, suggesting it's either trivial, circular, or simply wrong. But regardless of who's right in these technical debates, the cogito illustrates a fundamental problem for self-knowledge. Even when we achieve certainty about one aspect of ourselves, that certainty proves remarkably limited. It doesn't extend to the aspects of ourselves we most want to know about. When you try to know yourself, you want to understand your character, your values, your authentic desires, your deep motivations, your place in the world, your relationships to others, your potential for growth or decline, your true nature beneath all the roles you play and masks you wear. The cogito, even if we accept it completely, tells you none of this. It gives you a bare point of self-awareness, a minimal self that's certain to exist, but that carries almost no content. The rich, textured self you want to know remains as elusive as ever. Descartes believed that once he established the certainty of his existence and the existence of a benevolent God, he could go on to rebuild knowledge on secure foundations. But his successors, following his method of radical doubt, often concluded that no such rebuilding was possible. The foundation was too small, the structure too ambitious. We're left knowing only that we exist as thinking things, with everything else remaining questionable, uncertain, open to doubt. As you rest in the quiet darkness, consider the strange situation Descartes left us in. You are absolutely certain you exist. Right now, in this moment, you cannot doubt that you are aware of these words, these thoughts. But what are you really? Are you your body, your brain, your memories, your personality, your consciousness? All of these together, something else entirely. The certainty of existence does not resolve the mystery of essence. You know you are, but not what you are. And without knowing what you are, can you truly claim to know yourself? The cogito reveals and conceals simultaneously. It reveals the bare fact of self-existence while concealing everything that makes you who you are. Tomorrow you will wake, certain once again that you exist, still uncertain about almost everything else. The paradox persists. The one thing you know for certain tells you almost nothing. But there's another challenge to self-knowledge that Descartes barely considered, one that makes the paradox even more troubling. Not only is the self difficult to observe, not only does the observer change what's observed, not only does certainty about existence leave essence unknown, the self also changes constantly from moment to moment, making it a moving target that can never be pinned down. This is the problem of the changing self, the challenge that ancient philosophers identified, but that takes on new urgency in light of modern understanding. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus famously declared, that you cannot step into the same river twice. The river is constantly flowing, constantly changing. The water you stepped into a moment ago has moved downstream, replaced by different water. The river remains the river in name, but its substance is never the same. He applied this same logic to the self. You are like a river, constantly changing, never the same from one moment to the next. The self you examine today is not the self you examined yesterday. By the time you achieve knowledge of who you are, you've already become someone else. This creates a temporal paradox for self-knowledge. Knowledge takes time. You must observe yourself, reflect on your observations, integrate them into understanding. But during the time this process unfolds, you're changing. Your thoughts evolve, your moods shift, your body renews itself cell by cell. Your memories are constantly being revised and reconsolidated. Your beliefs adjust in response to new information. Your desires strengthen or weaken or transform entirely. The self is not a static object that can be examined at leisure. It's a process, a flowing stream, a constant becoming. Modern science has confirmed Heraclitus in stunning detail. Your body replaces nearly all its cells over the course of 7 to 10 years. The atoms that currently constitute your body will mostly be gone within a relatively short time, replaced by new atoms from the food you eat and the air you breathe. The physical substance of your body is continuously recycled. You are like a fountain, maintaining a stable form even though the water passes through constantly. The pattern persists while the substance changes. Even your brain, which we tend to think of as relatively stable, is constantly being rewired. Synaptic connections strengthen or weaken based on experience. New neurons are generated in certain regions throughout life. Neural networks reorganize themselves in response to learning and trauma. The brain you had yesterday is literally not the same brain you have today. The physical substrate of your mind is in constant flux. Your memories, rather than being permanent recordings etched into your brain, are more like stories that get retold and revised each time you remember them. Neuroscience shows that the act of remembering changes the memory. Each time you recall an event, you're not accessing a fixed record, but reconstructing the memory from scattered pieces. And in the reconstruction, you introduce changes. Your past is continuously being rewritten by your present. The person you remember being might never have existed quite the way you remember them. Your personality, which you might think of as your stable core, changes more than you realize. Psychological research shows that personality traits fluctuate over time, sometimes dramatically. The person you were at age 15 is very different from the person you are at age 35 or 55. Your values shift, your priorities rearrange themselves, your temperament mellows or intensifies. Looking back at your younger self often produces a sense of alienation. Was that really me? The continuity we feel is partly an illusion, a story we tell ourselves to create coherent identity across time. Even from moment to moment, you're not the same. Your mood changes, your energy level fluctuates, your attention shifts, your physical state varies, your context influences how you think and feel. You're different when you're hungry versus sated, tired versus rested, alone versus with others, stressed versus relaxed. Which of these states reveals the real you? The answer seems to be all of them and none of them. There is no single stable self underlying these variations. The variations are all you are. This creates a profound problem for self-knowledge. When you try to know yourself, which self are you trying to know? The self of this moment. But that self is already gone, replaced by a slightly different self in the next moment. The self over time. But that's not a single entity, but a sequence of selves, each one slightly different from the last. Your past self is like another person, someone you used to know, but who no longer exists. Your future self is equally unknown, a stranger you haven't met yet. The philosopher Derek Parfit explored this problem through thought experiments. Imagine a teleportation device that scans your body atom by atom, destroys the original, and recreates an exact copy on Mars. The copy has all your memories, your personality, your sense of identity. From its perspective, it feels like it's simply teleported. But are you the copy? Or did you die when the original was destroyed? If the original wasn't destroyed but the copy was still created, which one would be you? Both, neither. Parfit argues that personal identity is not what we think it is. There's no substantial self that persists through time. There's just psychological and physical continuity, and these can come in degrees. You're somewhat the same person you were yesterday, less similar to who you were 10 years ago, barely related to who you were as a child. The identity is conventional, a useful fiction, but not a deep metaphysical truth. If Parfit is right, then the quest for self-knowledge is even more paradoxical than we thought. You're trying to know something that doesn't exist as a stable entity. You're trying to grasp a pattern that's constantly shifting, a process that has no fixed nature. It's like trying to catch the wind or pin down a cloud. By the time you think you've understood yourself, that self has transformed into something else. This impermanence also affects your ability to trust past self-knowledge. Even if you somehow achieved perfect understanding of yourself yesterday, that knowledge would be obsolete today. You would need to start over, examining a self that's similar to yesterday's self, but not identical to it. Self-knowledge would need to be continuously updated, revised, refreshed. It could never be complete because completion would require the self to stop changing, which would mean it stops being alive. The Buddhist tradition, which we'll explore in more depth later, saw this impermanence as central to their analysis of self. They recognized that if the self is constantly changing, it cannot be a permanent, essential thing. The sense of having a stable identity is an illusion created by the continuity of memory and the similarity between adjacent moments. But there is no unchanging core, no essential self that persists beneath the surface changes. You are the change itself, the flowing stream that has no substance apart from the flowing. This insight can be vertiginous. If you're not the same person you were a moment ago, then who are you trying to become? If your future self will be different enough that they're essentially another person, why should you care about their welfare? Why save for retirement or maintain your health or invest in education when the person who benefits will be someone else? The sense of continuity, even if it's partly illusory, seems necessary for a meaningful life. Yet the impermanence is undeniable. Each time you achieve some insight into yourself, you must hold it lightly, knowing it captures only a moment, only one configuration of a system that's continuously reconfiguring itself. The self-knowledge you have is like a photograph, a frozen moment that accurately represents that instant, but that immediately becomes historical, documenting something that no longer exists in quite that form. The changing self also means that different techniques of self-examination might reveal different selves. Psychoanalysis, meditation, personality tests, brain scans, behavioral observation, introspection. Each of these approaches captures a different aspect of the complex, changing phenomenon we call the self. And each might give a different answer to the question, who are you? There's no neutral standpoint from which to judge which method reveals the truth, because the truth itself keeps shifting. As you drift towards sleep, notice how your sense of self loosens and dissolves. The boundaries that seemed so clear while you were fully awake become permeable. Your identity feels less fixed, more fluid. Thoughts arise that you might not claim as your own. You might see images or hear words that seem to come from somewhere other than your conscious mind. This nightly dissolution of the self might be revealing something true, that the stable, unified self is always partly a construction, an achievement of waking consciousness that requires effort to maintain. Tomorrow you will wake and reassemble the self, gathering the scattered pieces back into a coherent whole. But it will be a slightly different whole than today's self, subtly transformed by the night's experiences, by the processing that happened in sleep, by the simple fact that time has passed and change has occurred. You will think you're the same person who went to sleep, and in most important respects, you will be. But something will have shifted, adapted, evolved. The river flows on, never the same yet always the river. The paradox of the changing self can be resolved. You must pursue self-knowledge even though the self you're pursuing is always one step ahead, always already transforming into something else. The knowledge you achieve is always knowledge of what you were, never quite knowledge of what you are. And by the time you finish reading this sentence, you've already changed again. Now we turn to a philosophical tradition that approached the paradox of self-knowledge from a radically different angle, arriving at a conclusion so counterintuitive that it seems almost incomprehensible at first. Yet this conclusion might offer the most profound response to our paradox yet. What if the problem of self-knowledge is unsolvable because there is no self to know? The Buddha, teaching in India around the same time Socrates was questioning Athenians, developed a doctrine that struck at the root of the self-knowledge paradox. He taught anatta, often translated as no self or non-self, one of the most distinctive and challenging insights in Buddhist philosophy. According to this teaching, the fundamental assumption underlying all attempts at self-knowledge is simply wrong. There is no permanent, essential self to know. The very notion of a self is a misunderstanding, a conceptual error that causes enormous suffering. This seems almost impossible to accept. Surely there must be a self. Who is sitting here reading these words if not a self? Who thinks thoughts, feels emotions, makes decisions, remembers the past, plans for the future? The sense of being a self is perhaps the most intimate, immediate aspect of our experience. To suggest it's an illusion seems absurd, offensive even. It feels like being told you don't exist. But the Buddha's teaching is more subtle than simple denial. He's not saying that persons don't exist in any sense. He's not claiming you're not real. He's making a specific claim that when you search for a permanent, unchanging, independent self that constitutes your essential identity, you won't find it. What you find instead is a collection of processes that are constantly changing, constantly dependent on conditions, completely impermanent. The sense of self arises from this collection, but there's no substantial thing that is the self. To understand this, consider the Buddha's analysis of what we call a person. He identified 5 aggregates, 5 categories of phenomena that together create the illusion of a unified self. First is form, the physical body with its sense organs. Second is feeling, the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral tone that accompanies each experience. Third is perception, the recognition and labeling of what we encounter. Fourth is mental formations, thoughts, emotions, intentions, habits, all the mental activities that shape experience. Fifth is consciousness, the awareness of the other 4 aggregates. Now examine each of these aggregates closely. The body is constantly changing, continuously aging, subject to illness and death. Can this be your permanent self? Feelings come and go, arising and passing away moment by moment. Can these fluctuating states be your essential identity? Perceptions shift, influenced by attention, context, prior experience. Can this be the unchanging core of who you are? Mental formations are perhaps the most obviously impermanent. Thoughts bubble up and dissolve, emotions surge and subside, intentions form and fade. Consciousness itself is inconstant, varying in intensity and clarity, absent during deep sleep and certain meditative states. So where is the self? Is it the body? That's constantly changing. Is it consciousness? That's intermittent and variable. Is it some combination of these aggregates? But combinations change when their components change. Is it something separate from the aggregates, something that has these experiences without being identical to them? But then what is it? How would you know about it? All your knowledge comes through the aggregates. If the self is something beyond them, it's completely unknowable. The Buddha argued that identifying with any of these aggregates causes suffering. When you think, I am my body, you suffer when the body ages or becomes ill. When you think, I am my feelings, you're tossed about by every emotional wave. When you think, I am my thoughts, you're trapped by the mind's endless commentary. The solution is to recognize that none of these phenomena constitute a self. They arise and pass away according to causes and conditions, but there's no essential you at the center of this process. This is not nihilism. The Buddha explicitly rejected the view that nothing exists. Persons exist conventionally, as names for the collection of aggregates. Just as a chariot exists conventionally as a name for wheels, axle, body, and other parts assembled in a certain way, a person exists as a name for the 5 aggregates functioning together. But there's no chariot essence separate from the parts, and there's no person essence separate from the aggregates. When you search for the self, you find only the parts, not a substantial thing that has the parts. Consider how this resolves our earlier paradoxes. The observer's dilemma disappears because there's no permanent observer to create the infinite regress. Observing happens, but there's no substantial self doing the observing. The changing self problem dissolves because there was no unchanging self to be eroded by change. What changes is just the aggregates, and these were always changing. There was never a stable entity to lose. The gap between existence and essence vanishes because there was no essential self whose nature needed to be known. There's just this flow of experience, these processes arising and passing away, with no substantial entity behind them. The Buddha taught that once you truly realize no self, not just intellectually, but experientially, through deep meditation and insight, suffering ceases. You stop clinging to experiences as mine. Stop trying to protect and defend a self that doesn't exist. Stop being tossed about by the vicissitudes of life because you recognize that there's no stable self to be threatened. This realization is liberation, awakening, enlightenment. It's the end of the futile search for something that was never there. But understanding this intellectually is different from realizing it experientially. The sense of self is so deeply ingrained, so apparently self-evident, that simply being told it's an illusion doesn't dissolve it. The Buddha prescribed meditation practices designed to help people see this truth directly. Through sustained attention to experience, meditators begin to notice how everything that seems solid and permanent is actually in flux. The body is not a thing, but a process. Thoughts are not yours, but events that arise and pass. Feelings come and go like weather. The sense of self starts to seem less substantial, more like a convenient fiction than a metaphysical fact. Advanced meditators report experiences where the sense of self temporarily dissolves. Instead of feeling like a subject observing experiences, they simply are the experience, with no separation between observer and observed. Instead of thoughts feeling like something they're doing, thoughts just appear and disappear without anyone thinking them. Instead of a unified self, there's just this field of experience with various phenomena arising within it. These experiences, they report, reveal what's actually true all the time, but which is normally obscured by the strong illusion of selfhood. But here's a fascinating twist. Even to pursue this realization requires using the concept of self pragmatically. You have to practice meditation, which means you, the practitioner, must make effort. You have to examine your experience, which requires an observer examining what's observed. You have to want liberation, which presumes someone who will be liberated. The path to realizing no self seems to require assuming there is a self who can walk the path. This is sometimes called the paradox of the path. You need a self to realize there's no self. Buddhist teachers handle this paradox by distinguishing between ultimate truth and conventional truth. Ultimately, there is no self. But conventionally, we can speak of persons, selves, practitioners. The conventional self is useful, even necessary, for navigating ordinary life. The problem arises when we take the conventional self to be ultimately real, when we reify it into a permanent, essential thing. The practice is to use the conventional self to realize ultimate truth, at which point the conventional self is recognized as a useful fiction, but not a metaphysical fact. Some Buddhist scholars argue about exactly what no self means. Is it the claim that selves don't exist in any sense, or the claim that selves exist but not as permanent substances? Is it a metaphysical thesis about reality, or a practical teaching about how to reduce suffering? Different Buddhist schools give different answers, and these debates have continued for over 2,000 years. But they all agree on the fundamental insight. The solid, permanent, independent self we instinctively believe in is not to be found when we search carefully. The implications for self-knowledge are radical. If there's no self, then the entire project of self-knowledge is misconceived. You're trying to know something that doesn't exist. It's like trying to learn everything about unicorns or leprechauns. The proper response is not to seek better methods of self-knowledge, but to abandon the search altogether, to recognize that the question was based on a false assumption. Yet this doesn't mean the introspection is useless. Examining your experience carefully, watching how thoughts and feelings arise and pass, observing the impermanent nature of all phenomena, these practices have value, but their value lies not in achieving self-knowledge, but in seeing through the illusion of self. The more clearly you observe experience, the more evident it becomes that there's no one experiencing it, just experiencing itself. This might sound mystical or obscure, but it's actually quite precise. Try to find the self right now. Look for the entity that's aware of these words. Is it in your head, in your chest, everywhere in your body, nowhere in particular? Can you locate it? When you try to pin it down, it seems to slip away, like trying to grab water. You find thoughts, sensations, perceptions, but where is the self that has these experiences? The more carefully you look, the more it recedes. This isn't because you're looking badly. It's because there's nothing there to find. Some neuroscientists have reached similar conclusions through different routes. The brain creates the sense of self as a useful model, a way of organizing experience and planning action. But it's a model, not a thing. Just as a map is not the territory, the self model is not a substantial self. The brain produces the illusion of a unified, continuous self because that's adaptive for survival. But it's a controlled hallucination, a necessary fiction, not an accurate description of reality. This converges with the Buddha's teaching from a completely different direction. The scientific study of consciousness and the meditative examination of experience both suggest that what we call the self is a process, not an entity. It's something the brain does, not something the brain contains. It's a verb masquerading as a noun, an activity mistaken for a substance. For those seeking self-knowledge, the Buddhist teaching offers a radical resolution. Stop seeking. The search for self-knowledge presumes a self to know. But if careful examination reveals there is no such self, the search becomes pointless. Instead of trying to know yourself, simply observe how experience unfolds without anyone experiencing it. Instead of seeking to understand who you are, recognize that there's no stable who to understand. Instead of trying to solve the paradox of self-knowledge, see that the paradox dissolves when the self dissolves. This doesn't mean you become nothing or that you cease to exist. Life continues, experience happens, actions occur, but they happen without a substantial self at the center. It's like a river flowing without a river entity separate from the flowing, like dancing without a dancer separate from the dance, like knowing without a knower separate from the known. This way of being requires a shift so profound that it can seem incomprehensible from outside it. But those who report experiencing it describe a lightness, a freedom, a release from the burden of maintaining and defending a self that never existed. As consciousness fades toward sleep tonight, you might notice how the sense of self naturally loosens and disperses. The solid I that dominated waking experience becomes more diffuse, more porous. This might offer a glimpse of what the Buddhist teaching points toward, a mode of being where experience happens without being owned by a self, where awareness continues without a substantial entity being aware. Sleep offers a nightly dissolution of self, a temporary liberation from the illusion of permanent identity. Tomorrow, you will wake and reconstruct the self, as you do every morning. But tonight, as the boundaries dissolve, you might sense the truth the Buddha tried to convey. There was never really anyone there to begin with, just this flowing stream of experience, momentarily organized into patterns we mistake for a self. The question that haunted ancient philosophers now takes on new dimensions in light of modern science. Over the past century, psychologists and neuroscientists have been mapping the mind with unprecedented precision, revealing mechanisms of consciousness that our ancestors could only speculate about. And what they've discovered often confirms the paradoxes we've been exploring, while adding new layers of complexity. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each one connected to thousands of others through trillions of synapses. These neural networks process information in parallel, with different systems handling vision, hearing, movement, emotion, memory, language, and countless other functions. But nowhere in this vast complexity do scientists find a single location that could be called the self. There's no central command center where the self resides. No CEO neuron making executive decisions. Instead, the sense of self emerges from the coordinated activity of multiple distributed systems that often operate with conflicting agendas. One of the most fascinating discoveries comes from split brain research. Patients who had their corpus callosum surgically severed to treat epilepsy provided a window into how the brain creates the sense of self. The corpus callosum normally connects the left and right hemispheres, allowing them to communicate. When it's cut, each hemisphere can process information independently, without the other hemisphere knowing about it. Experimenters discovered they could show images to just one hemisphere, and elicit responses from it alone. What's truly remarkable is what happens when the left hemisphere tries to explain behaviors initiated by the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere, which controls language, constantly creates explanations for what the person is doing. When the right hemisphere saw an image and made the person pick up a shovel, the left hemisphere immediately confabulated a story. I picked up the shovel to clean out the chicken coop. The left hemisphere didn't know why the hand reached for the shovel, but it instantly created a plausible narrative. This interpreter function operates in all of us, not just split-brain patients. The left hemisphere acts as a narrator, creating stories about our behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that make them seem coherent and intentional. But these narratives are often fictional. The real causes of our behavior lie in brain systems that don't communicate with the narrator. So the narrator makes up stories that sound reasonable, and we believe them because we don't have access to the actual mechanisms driving us. This should fundamentally change how we think about self-knowledge. When you ask yourself why you did something, the answer you get isn't retrieved from some reliable memory store of your true motivations. It's generated on the spot by a system whose job is to create coherent narratives, whether or not those narratives are accurate. You are, in a very real sense, a stranger to yourself. The storyteller in your head is making up your life story as it goes along. Studies of decision-making reveal similar gaps between what we think we're doing and what's actually happening. Neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted famous experiments showing that brain activity associated with initiating an action begins hundreds of milliseconds before people report becoming consciously aware of the decision to act. The unconscious brain has already committed to the action before consciousness knows anything about it. Then consciousness claims the decision as its own, creating the illusion that I consciously chose to act. More recent experiments have refined these findings, showing complex patterns of neural activity that predict decisions seconds before people consciously make them. If scientists can predict your decision from your brain activity before you're aware of deciding, in what sense did you consciously make the decision? The conscious self seems to be the last to know, receiving reports about decisions that have already been made elsewhere in the brain, and then claiming authorship of them. This doesn't mean we lack free will exactly. The relationship between consciousness, decision-making, and action is more subtle than that, but it does mean that the conscious self who thinks they're making decisions is not in as much control as it feels like. Much of what we do is determined by brain processes we don't have access to, processed by systems we're unaware of, based on information we never consciously considered. The self that thinks it knows itself is receiving carefully curated reports from a vast unconscious bureaucracy that does most of the actual work. Freud famously compared the ego to a rider on a horse, where the horse represents the id's unconscious drives. The rider likes to think they're in control, directing where the horse goes, but really the horse goes where it wants, and the rider mostly rationalizes the horse's choices after the fact. Modern neuroscience suggests this metaphor undersells the problem. It's not just that unconscious drives influence us, it's that almost everything happens unconsciously, with consciousness serving primarily as a public relations department that creates post hoc explanations. Consider cognitive biases, those systematic errors in thinking that psychologists have catalogued by the dozens. We're subject to confirmation bias, only noticing information that confirms our beliefs. We're prone to the fundamental attribution error, explaining our own behavior by circumstances, but others' behavior by character. We're vulnerable to the sunk cost fallacy, throwing good money after bad because we've already invested so much. We fall victim to countless other biases that distort our judgment without our awareness. The troubling part is that simply knowing about these biases doesn't protect you from them. Psychologists who study cognitive biases aren't immune to them. Knowing intellectually that you're prone to confirmation bias doesn't stop you from being prone to confirmation bias. The biases operate at a level that conscious knowledge can't easily reach. You might even notice yourself falling victim to a bias while you're doing it, yet be unable to stop. The machinery of the mind operates according to its own logic, largely impervious to conscious intention. This reveals another dimension of the self-knowledge paradox. Even when we learn psychological truths about how the mind works, we can't necessarily apply them to ourselves. The knowledge remains somehow external, abstract, theoretical. It doesn't penetrate to the level where behavior is actually generated. You can know you're being irrational while continuing to be irrational. You can recognize you're deceiving yourself while continuing to deceive yourself. The gap between knowing about the mind and actually changing it can be unbridgeable. Memory research adds yet another layer of complexity. We tend to think of memory as a recording device that faithfully stores experiences for later retrieval. But memory doesn't work that way at all. Each time you remember something, you're reconstructing it from fragments scattered across multiple brain regions. The reconstruction is influenced by your current beliefs, emotions, and expectations. You don't retrieve memories, you recreate them. And in the recreation, you introduce changes. This means your autobiographical memory, the story of your life that you think you know, is constantly being revised. The past you remember is partly fictional, edited and revised by your present self. Events that seemed important at the time might fade or disappear entirely. Minor details might be promoted to central significance. Emotions associated with memories intensify or dampen. You might even develop false memories of events that never happened, if the false memory fits well enough with your current self-conception. So when you try to know yourself through examining your history, you're not accessing objective facts about who you were. You're accessing a story about who you were, one that's been edited by every subsequent self you've been between then and now. The person you remember being might be quite different from who you actually were. Self-knowledge through memory is self-knowledge of a fiction, a narrative that has been shaped by years of unconscious revision. Personality psychology reveals that we're also much less consistent than we believe. We think we have stable traits that define who we are across situations. But research shows that behavior is highly context-dependent. You're a different person at work versus at home, with friends versus with strangers, when tired versus when rested, when stressed versus when relaxed. The personality you think defines your essential nature is actually a collection of situation-specific response patterns that only appear stable because we're usually in similar situations. Studies have shown that if you want to predict how someone will behave, situation is often more informative than personality. Knowing the context tells you more than knowing the person's supposed traits. This doesn't mean personality doesn't exist, but it means it's more fluid and contextual than our intuitions suggest. The stable, consistent self we imagine ourselves to be is partly an illusion, a story we tell to create coherence across highly variable behaviors. Sam Harris, a neuroscientist and philosopher, invites people to conduct a simple experiment that demonstrates something profound about the self. In meditation, try to look for the thinker behind your thoughts. Surely there must be an I producing the thoughts, a subject that thoughts are occurring to. But when you actually look, you can't find it. Thoughts simply appear, arising from nowhere, without any sense of an agent producing them. There's thinking but no thinker, experiencing but no experiencer. The self seems to be something thoughts claim to belong to, but it's not actually there as a separate entity. This echoes both Buddhist insights and split-brain research and memory studies. From multiple directions, science is revealing that the unified, stable, autonomous self is not what it seems. It's an emergent property, a useful fiction, a story the brain tells itself. Understanding this doesn't make the illusion disappear entirely. You still feel like a self even when you know intellectually that the feeling is misleading. But the knowledge might loosen the grip of the illusion, might create some space between you and the story your brain creates about you. The implication for self-knowledge is sobering. You don't have privileged access to your own mind. You can't trust your narratives about why you do things. Your memories are unreliable. Your beliefs about your own consistency are wrong. Your sense of conscious control is overstated. The tools you would use to know yourself are themselves compromised, distorted, unreliable. It's like trying to see clearly through a funhouse mirror that warps everything it reflects. Yet you can't not try. The drive for self-understanding is too strong, too central to human existence. Even knowing all the ways self-knowledge fails, you continue examining yourself, trying to understand your motivations and patterns and potential. The paradox has been confirmed and deepened by modern science, but it hasn't been resolved. If anything, it's more paradoxical than ever. We know more about how the brain works than any previous generation, yet this knowledge reveals how little we know about ourselves. The more we understand the mechanisms of consciousness, the more mysterious the sense of self becomes. As you rest in the quiet darkness, your brain continues its ceaseless activity, processing the day's experiences, consolidating memories, dreaming dreams whose purposes remain obscure. 95% of this activity happens without your awareness. You are, right now, a vast unconscious process with a tiny spotlight of consciousness illuminating one small corner. And that spotlight believes itself to be the whole show. Tomorrow you will wake and resume the task of being a self, telling yourself stories about who you are and what you want, believing in the narrator even though you now know the narrator is unreliable. The knowledge doesn't free you from the illusion, but perhaps it creates a useful humility, a recognition that the self you think you know is mostly a mystery. But the paradox of self-knowledge isn't just about the difficulty of observing a moving target or the problem of consciousness examining itself. There's another dimension to this mystery that philosophers have identified, one that reveals fundamental limits to what any mind can know about itself. This is what we might call the knowledge paradox. The more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. The 20th century Hungarian-British philosopher Michael Polanyi articulated a version of this paradox that bears his name. Polanyi observed that we can know more than we can tell, that human knowledge often exceeds our ability to express it explicitly. Consider riding a bicycle. You know how to balance, how to steer, how to adjust your body weight to stay upright and navigate turns. But can you explain exactly how you do it? Can you articulate the precise movements and adjustments that allow you to ride? Most people cannot. The knowledge is tacit, embodied, impossible to fully verbalize. This tacit dimension of knowledge pervades human existence. You know how to recognize faces, but you can't explain the algorithm your brain uses. You know your native language, but you can't state all the grammatical rules you follow unconsciously. You know how to maintain appropriate social distance in conversation, but you'd struggle to specify exactly how you calculate it. You know how to catch a ball, walk on uneven ground, identify emotions in voices, and perform countless other skills without being able to explain how you do any of them. Now apply this to self-knowledge. Much of what you know about yourself is tacit, inaccessible to conscious introspection. You know how you typically respond to stress, but you can't fully articulate the internal process that generates the response. You know what kinds of people you're attracted to, but you can't specify the criteria your unconscious mind applies. You know what you find funny or boring or moving, but you can't reduce this knowledge to explicit rules. The self contains depths that cannot be brought fully into consciousness, cannot be translated into words, cannot be known in the way we know facts we can state clearly. This means that complete self-knowledge is not just difficult, but impossible in principle. There will always be aspects of yourself that you know but cannot tell, dimensions of your being that operate below the threshold of explicit awareness. You function according to patterns you cannot articulate, respond to cues you don't consciously notice, make judgments based on implicit criteria you've never formulated verbally. The explicit self-knowledge you might achieve will always be incomplete, leaving out the vast implicit knowledge that actually guides most of your behavior. There's also a more general knowledge paradox that ancient philosophers recognized. The more you learn about any subject, the more you become aware of how much you don't know. When you're ignorant of a subject, you might think it's simple and your ignorance is small. But as you learn more, you discover layers of complexity you didn't know existed. The edges of your knowledge expand to touch larger territories of unknown. Your circle of understanding grows, but so does the circumference of that circle where the known meets the unknown. Socrates understood this perfectly. His wisdom consisted in knowing that he didn't know. Those who thought themselves wise were actually doubly ignorant because they didn't know that they didn't know. Their ignorance was invisible to them, hidden behind false confidence. True wisdom begins with the recognition of how much remains unknown, unknowable, beyond the reach of current understanding. This applies powerfully to self-knowledge. When you're young and haven't examined yourself much, you might feel you know who you are quite well. Life is simple. Identity is clear. Choices are obvious. But as you age and experience accumulates, you realize how little you understood. You discover contradictions in yourself, motivations you didn't suspect, capacities you didn't know you possessed. The self becomes more complex, more mysterious, less transparent. The more you examine yourself, the more there is to examine. The project of self-knowledge expands faster than knowledge can accumulate. Modern psychology has documented this pattern with the Dunning-Kruger effect. People with minimal competence in a domain tend to overestimate their ability. They don't know enough to recognize how much they don't know. As competence increases, self-assessment becomes more accurate, often resulting in lower confidence because they now appreciate the full complexity of the domain. Experts are acutely aware of the limits of their knowledge, of the uncertainties and ambiguities that persist even after decades of study. The same pattern appears in self-knowledge. Someone who has never seriously examined themselves might feel confident they know who they are. But someone who has spent years in therapy, meditation, self-reflection, and introspection often becomes less confident, more tentative, more aware of how much remains murky and uncertain. Deep self-examination reveals that the self is not a simple thing to be known, but a complex process involving conscious and unconscious elements, stable patterns and radical contingency, explicit beliefs and implicit assumptions. The knowledge paradox creates a peculiar situation. The pursuit of self-knowledge leads inevitably to greater awareness of self-ignorance. Each insight reveals new territories of not knowing. Each layer you peel back exposes another layer beneath. The journey inward is infinite. There is always more depth to explore. You can spend an entire lifetime getting to know yourself and still die a stranger to yourself in many ways. This is not pessimistic, but realistic. It suggests that self-knowledge is not a destination, but a journey, not an achievement, but a practice, not a final answer, but an ongoing inquiry. You will never reach complete self-knowledge, so the point cannot be to reach it. The point must be the journey itself, the continuous process of examination, questioning, discovery, revision. The value lies not in arriving at certainty, but in maintaining curiosity, not in solving the mystery, but in living with it. There's also what we might call an epistemological humility that follows from recognizing these limits. If you can't fully know yourself, you certainly can't fully know anyone else. The other person is at least as complex, at least as opaque, at least as riddled with unconscious processes and tacit knowledge as you are. Claims to understand someone else completely should always be viewed with suspicion. We're all mysteries to ourselves, and therefore certainly mysteries to each other. This humility can be liberating. It removes the burden of needing to have yourself figured out, of needing to present a completely coherent identity to the world. You're allowed to be inconsistent, contradictory, surprising even to yourself. You're allowed to not know why you do what you do, feel what you feel, want what you want. The confession, "I don't know," becomes a mark of wisdom rather than ignorance, an acknowledgement of the fundamental mystery at the core of human existence. It also changes how you relate to your own judgments and decisions. If you can't fully know yourself, you can't be certain that your choices reflect your true values or authentic desires. Maybe you're being influenced by factors you're unaware of, following patterns you haven't recognized, pursuing goals that were implanted by culture or conditioning rather than chosen consciously. This uncertainty should create a certain tentativeness, a willingness to revise judgments, a humility about claiming to know what's best even for yourself. Yet this tentativeness has its own dangers. Carried too far, it becomes paralysis, an inability to commit to anything because commitment requires a confidence you can't honestly claim. There must be a balance between healthy skepticism about self-knowledge and the practical necessity of making choices based on whatever understanding you have, incomplete though it may be. You have to live as if you know yourself well enough, even while acknowledging that you don't and cannot. This points toward a paradoxical wisdom. You must pursue self-knowledge while accepting that complete self-knowledge is impossible. You must examine yourself carefully while recognizing that the examination is always incomplete and often misleading. You must make choices based on self-understanding while remaining open to the possibility that your self-understanding is wrong. It's a both and rather than an either or. Pursue knowledge and accept ignorance. Examine carefully and hold conclusions lightly. Know yourself and acknowledge mystery. The knowledge paradox also appears in a different form in the pursuit of self-knowledge. To know something, you typically need to step back from it, create some distance, observe it from outside. But with the self, you cannot step outside. You are irrevocably inside your own experience, cannot achieve the external perspective that knowledge seems to require. Any observation you make is made from within the very thing you're trying to observe. The eye cannot see itself except in a mirror, and even then it sees only a reflection, not the eye as it actually is. This internal perspective problem means that certain aspects of yourself will remain forever invisible to you. How you appear to others, the tone of your voice, the expressions that cross your face, the way your presence affects a room. These things can be reported to you, but never directly experienced. You live in a subjective bubble, with access only to your internal states and never to the external perspective others have of you. Your self-knowledge is always from the inside, partial, limited by your position inside the very thing you're trying to know. Others see aspects of you that you cannot see. They notice patterns in your behavior you're blind to, detect emotions you're unaware of expressing, perceive inconsistencies between what you say and how you act. Their knowledge of you, though external and incomplete in its own ways, complements your internal knowledge. Complete self-knowledge, if such a thing were possible, would require somehow combining the internal and external perspectives, seeing yourself as you experience yourself and as others experience you. But this synthesis is impossible because the two perspectives are incommensurable, cannot be fully integrated into a single coherent picture. As you drift towards sleep, holding all these paradoxes lightly, you might sense a strange freedom in accepting them. You don't have to know yourself completely. You can't know yourself completely. The mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a feature of consciousness itself. Tomorrow, you will continue the impossible task of self-knowledge, asking who you are, examining your thoughts and feelings, trying to understand your motivations and desires. And that's okay. The pursuit matters even when the goal is unattainable. The question matters even when no final answer exists. You are, and will remain, a mystery to yourself. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Beyond the limits of knowledge in general lies a more specific set of obstacles that make self-knowledge particularly difficult, perhaps impossible. These are not just philosophical puzzles or theoretical problems. They are practical barriers embedded in the very structure of human cognition, the ways our minds are designed to work that systematically interfere with accurate self-assessment. Cognitive biases represent one category of these obstacles. Our minds employ shortcuts for processing information quickly, and these shortcuts often lead to systematic errors in judgment. Confirmation bias causes us to notice and remember information that confirms what we already believe, while overlooking or forgetting information that contradicts our beliefs. When applied to self-knowledge, this means we tend to see evidence that supports our existing self-concept and miss evidence that contradicts it. If you believe you're kind, you'll notice all the kind things you do and forget or rationalize the unkind ones. Your self-knowledge becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, where your beliefs about yourself determine what evidence you notice, which reinforces your beliefs. Hindsight bias makes past events seem more predictable than they actually were. Looking back, you think you knew something would happen, even though you didn't predict it at the time. This distorts your understanding of your own knowledge and judgment. You remember yourself as having been wiser or more perceptive than you actually were, which gives you false confidence in your current judgment. You think you learn from experience, but hindsight bias means you're often learning the wrong lessons, taking credit for insights you didn't actually have. The fundamental attribution error causes you to explain your own behavior by circumstances, but others' behavior by character. When you fail, it's because the task was difficult, or you were unlucky, or conditions weren't right. When others fail, it's because they lack ability or didn't try hard enough. This asymmetry means you develop a distorted view of yourself as more shaped by external forces than you really are, while seeing others as more defined by internal traits. Your self-knowledge becomes systematically different from your knowledge of others. But since both views can't be correct, at least one must be wrong. The self-serving bias leads you to take credit for success, but deny responsibility for failure. When things go well, it's because of your skill, effort, or wisdom. When things go badly, it's bad luck, other people's incompetence, or circumstances beyond your control. This protects self-esteem, but destroys accurate self-assessment. You develop an inflated view of your abilities and contributions, chronically overestimating how much your successes depend on you, while underestimating how much your failures reveal about your limitations. None of these biases are conscious choices. You don't decide to be overconfident or self-serving or subject to hindsight bias. These patterns operate automatically, below awareness, shaping your perceptions before you have a chance to correct them. And simply knowing about them doesn't immunize you from them. Psychologists who study cognitive biases aren't immune to cognitive biases. Intellectual knowledge of how the mind distorts reality doesn't prevent the mind from continuing to distort reality. Motivational factors create another layer of obstacles. You have strong psychological needs that interfere with accurate self-knowledge. The need for self-esteem pushes you toward viewing yourself positively, filtering out or minimizing information that would threaten your positive self-regard. The need for consistency drives you to overlook contradictions in your beliefs and behaviors, maintaining a coherent self-narrative even when your actual behavior is highly inconsistent. The need to believe you're in control leads you to overestimate your agency, underestimate how much you're shaped by factors beyond your control. These needs aren't optional. They're built into human psychology, serving important functions for mental health and social functioning. People with accurate self-knowledge are often more depressed than people with inflated self-regard. Some degree of positive illusion about yourself might be necessary for well-being, but this means that mental health and accurate self-knowledge are in tension. You might have to choose between feeling good about yourself and seeing yourself accurately. The mind, given this choice, usually opts for feeling good. Defense mechanisms, as Freud and later psychologists documented, systematically distort self-knowledge to protect the ego from threatening information. Repression pushes uncomfortable thoughts and feelings out of awareness. Projection attributes your own unacceptable impulses to others. Rationalization creates plausible but false explanations for behavior whose real motives would be difficult to acknowledge. Denial simply refuses to recognize facts that would be too painful to accept. These mechanisms operate unconsciously, by definition. If you were aware they were operating, they wouldn't work. So you remain blind to the very processes that keep you blind to yourself. Social construction of self adds yet another complication. Your sense of who you are is not formed in isolation, but through interactions with others. You learn about yourself partly through the mirror others provide, through how they respond to you and what they reflect back. But this social mirror is highly distorted. Others have their own biases, needs, and agendas that shape how they perceive and respond to you. They might see you through stereotypes, project their own issues onto you, interact with you based on their expectations rather than your actual characteristics. Moreover, you perform different selves in different social contexts. You're different with your family versus your colleagues versus your friends versus strangers. Each context calls out different aspects of your personality, different ways of being. So which one is the real you? The answer might be all of them and none of them. You're the sum of these various performances, but there's no essential self beneath them that could be known independently of the social context that evoked them. Culture shapes self-knowledge in even more fundamental ways. Your very concept of what a self is, what it means to know yourself, comes from your cultural context. Western cultures tend to emphasize individual autonomy, personal authenticity, unique identity. Eastern cultures often emphasize social roles, relational identity, harmony with others. These different frameworks lead to different ways of thinking about and seeking self-knowledge. There's no culture-free standpoint from which to know the self. No universal self that exists independently of cultural interpretation. Language itself creates barriers to self-knowledge. Your experience is continuous, fluid, ineffable. But to think about it, to communicate it to others, or even to yourself, you must translate it into words. And words are discrete, categorical, insufficient to capture the richness and subtlety of lived experience. The process of putting experience into language inevitably distorts it, simplifies it, makes it more definite than it actually is. Some aspects of your experience resist language entirely, remaining forever on the edge of what can be articulated. The ineffability problem is especially acute for consciousness itself. What it's like to be you, the felt quality of your experiences, the unique texture of your subjective perspective. These things cannot be fully captured in words. You can describe what you're experiencing, but the description is never adequate to the experience. The most intimate and immediate aspects of selfhood are precisely those that most resist explicit knowing, most stubbornly refuse to be translated into the public medium of language. Then, there are the unconscious factors we've discussed. The vast majority of mental processing that occurs below awareness, the implicit learning and memory that shape behavior without conscious access, the parallel processing in the brain that often produces contradictory outputs which consciousness must somehow reconcile. You're like an iceberg, with only a small portion visible above the waterline. The part you can examine, the part available to introspection, is dwarfed by the part that remains forever hidden from conscious view. Temporal factors create their own barriers. Self-knowledge requires memory, but memory is unreliable, constantly being reconstructed and revised. Your access to your own past is through memories that may be distorted, incomplete, or entirely false. And your present self is too close to itself to be seen clearly. It's like trying to focus your eyes on something pressed against them. Some distance is needed for clarity, but that distance is impossible when the observer and observed are identical. Future aspects of yourself are even more unknowable. You can't know how you'll respond to situations you haven't encountered, how you'll change as you age and gain experience, how you'll be affected by events you can't foresee. You might think you know what you'd do in a crisis, but research shows that people are remarkably bad at predicting their own behavior in novel situations. The self you'll become is not just unknown, but unknowable from your current position. All of these obstacles compound each other. Your memories are distorted by hindsight bias. Your self-assessment is inflated by self-serving bias. Your understanding of your motives is confabulated by the left hemisphere interpreter. Your perception of yourself is filtered through defense mechanisms operating unconsciously. Your sense of who you are is shaped by social mirrors that reflect you inaccurately. Your attempt to articulate your experience is frustrated by the limits of language. Your access to your own mind is blocked by the sheer volume of unconscious processing you cannot observe. Given all these barriers, perhaps the surprising thing is not that self-knowledge is difficult, but that we have any at all. Yet we do have some. Imperfect, partial, distorted as it may be, we aren't completely blind to ourselves. We know some things about our preferences, our values, our typical patterns of behavior and emotion. The question is how to improve this knowledge while remaining appropriately humble about its severe limitations. Some philosophers and psychologists suggest that the path to better self-knowledge paradoxically requires less introspection, not more. Ruminating about yourself, obsessing over your thoughts and feelings, constantly monitoring your internal states, These strategies often backfire, leading to distortion rather than clarity. Like a centipede that stops walking when it thinks too hard about which leg to move next, excessive self-focus can interfere with natural functioning. Instead, better self-knowledge might come from observing your behavior over time, noticing patterns in how you actually act rather than trusting your theories about why you act. It might come from soliciting honest feedback from others who see things you don't. It might come from experimenting with different ways of being, testing your assumptions about yourself against reality. It might come from accepting that complete self-knowledge is impossible and focusing instead on the practical self-understanding needed to live well, to make reasonable choices, to maintain relationships, to pursue meaningful goals. As you rest in darkness, all these obstacles to self-knowledge continue operating outside your awareness. Your brain is simplifying, distorting, filtering, confabulating, protecting, and systematically misleading you about who you are. This is not a bug, but a feature, not a flaw, but a function. The mind is designed to maintain coherent function, not to provide accurate self-knowledge. The two goals often conflict, and when they do, functioning takes priority over accuracy. You are a mystery to yourself by design, and this might be necessary for consciousness to work at all. Tomorrow, you will wake and resume the impossible project of self-knowledge, armed now with the awareness that the obstacles are not incidental but essential, not problems to be overcome, but permanent features of the human condition. The wisdom lies not in denying these obstacles, but in acknowledging them, working with them, accepting the limits they impose. You will never know yourself completely, but you can perhaps know yourself well enough to stumble forward with some grace, some humor, and some humility about the magnificent, impossible enterprise of being human. So where does all this leave us? We've traced the paradox of self-knowledge from ancient temples to modern laboratories, through philosophy and psychology, neuroscience and meditation. We've seen how the command to know yourself has echoed across centuries, recognized as both essential and impossible, both our highest calling and our deepest frustration. The pursuit cannot be abandoned, yet it cannot be completed. What then should we do with this impossible task? The first insight is that self-knowledge exists on a spectrum. Complete self-knowledge, perfect transparency to yourself, total understanding of who you are across all times and contexts. This is impossible for all the reasons we've explored. But complete self-ignorance is equally impossible. You're not a total stranger to yourself. You know some things about your preferences, your values, your typical patterns. The question isn't whether you have self-knowledge, but how much and how reliable it is. This spectrum suggests that we should think of self-knowledge not as an all-or-nothing achievement, but as a matter of degree. You can improve your self-understanding even if you can't perfect it. You can become somewhat less blind to your biases, somewhat more aware of your patterns, somewhat better at predicting how you'll respond to situations. The improvements will be incremental, the understanding always partial, but partial understanding is better than none. It also suggests we should be specific about what kind of self-knowledge we're pursuing. Do you want to know your personality traits, your unconscious motivations, your authentic values, your typical behaviors, your emotional patterns? Each of these is a different kind of knowledge, achievable to different degrees through different methods. Personality tests might give you rough categories that describe broad patterns. Therapy might reveal unconscious conflicts shaping your relationships. Meditation might help you observe the arising and passing of thoughts and emotions without being caught by them. Each approach offers a different window into the self, none of them complete, all of them limited, but each potentially valuable in its own way. The second insight is that the journey of self-examination matters more than any destination. Since complete self-knowledge is impossible, the value of the pursuit can't lie in achieving it. The value must lie in the pursuit itself, in what the ongoing practice of self-examination does to you and for you. This shifts the entire frame. You're not trying to solve a puzzle that can be solved. You're engaging in a practice that transforms you through the engagement. When Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living, he wasn't promising that examination would lead to certain knowledge. He was insisting that the questioning itself, the refusal to accept easy answers, the willingness to admit ignorance, these constitute the good life. The examined life is better not because it achieves perfect self-knowledge, but because the examination makes you different. It cultivates humility, curiosity, nuance, skepticism of your own certainties. It makes you more interesting to yourself and probably more bearable to others. The practice of self-examination also has practical value, despite its theoretical impossibility. Even flawed self-knowledge is useful. Knowing roughly what makes you angry, even if you don't know all the unconscious mechanisms involved, helps you avoid situations that will upset you. Knowing generally what you value, even if you can't rank your values perfectly, helps you make better decisions. Knowing your typical patterns of thinking and feeling, even if you're surprised by exceptions, gives you some ability to predict and manage your responses to events. Think of it like weather forecasting. Meteorologists can't predict the weather perfectly. Complex systems are inherently unpredictable beyond a certain point. But weather forecasts are still useful. A 70% chance of rain doesn't tell you with certainty whether it will rain, but it's better than no information. Similarly, imperfect self-knowledge is useful, even though it doesn't give you perfect self-understanding. You work with probabilities and patterns rather than certainties. The third insight is that different types of self-focused attention have very different effects. This is crucial for living with the paradox productively. Not all self-examination is created equal. Some forms of self-focus improve understanding and well-being. Others spiral into dysfunction and distortion. Psychologists distinguish between reflection and rumination, two modes of self-focus that look similar on the surface but diverge dramatically in their effects. Reflection is curious, open, exploratory. You observe your thoughts and feelings with interest and without harsh judgment. You ask questions. Why did I respond that way? What does this pattern tell me? What can I learn from this? Reflection integrates experience, creates meaning, facilitates growth. It's associated with better mental health, increased wisdom, improved self-knowledge. Rumination, by contrast, is repetitive, judgmental, stuck. You circle the same thoughts endlessly without making progress. You ask different questions. Why is this happening to me? What's wrong with me? Why can't I fix this? Rumination doesn't integrate experience. It fragments it. It doesn't create meaning. It amplifies distress. It's associated with depression, anxiety, worse self-knowledge rather than better. The difference lies not in whether you focus on yourself, but in how you do it. Reflection creates some distance from experience, allowing you to observe it without being overwhelmed by it. Rumination collapses this distance, fusing observer and observed into an anxious knot. Learning to cultivate reflection while avoiding rumination is perhaps the key practical skill for living with the paradox of self-knowledge. You need some self-examination to function well, but too much of the wrong kind makes everything worse. Mindfulness meditation offers one method for developing this reflective capacity. In mindfulness practice, You observe thoughts and feelings arising and passing without getting caught by them, without identifying with them as yours. You notice that thoughts simply appear, like clouds in the sky, without any substantial self producing them. This creates space between the observer and observed, reduces identification with mental content, and gradually reveals the fluid, processual nature of what we call the self. But mindfulness is a practice, not a theory. Intellectual understanding of meditation's insights doesn't replace the direct experience that comes from sustained practice. You can know intellectually that the self is impermanent and constructed, but this knowing remains abstract until you've observed it directly through meditation. The practice transforms understanding from something you know about to something you know, through lived experience. This embodied knowledge has different properties than theoretical knowledge, affects you differently, shapes your relationship to yourself in ways that mere intellectual understanding cannot. The fourth insight is that self-knowledge requires input from others. You can't achieve even partial self-understanding entirely through solitary introspection. You need the external perspective that only others can provide. They see patterns in your behavior you're blind to. They notice effects you have on the environment that you don't register. They perceive the gap between your intentions and your impact. Their feedback, when honest and constructive, reveals aspects of yourself that are invisible from the inside. But soliciting and receiving honest feedback is difficult. People are often reluctant to tell you things about yourself that might be uncomfortable. And you're often resistant to hearing information that contradicts your self-concept. The feedback that would be most valuable for self-knowledge is often exactly the feedback that's hardest to give and receive. This creates a paradox within the paradox. You need others to know yourself, but the social dynamics that make feedback possible often undermine the honesty that would make it useful. Therapy can create a special social space where honest reflection becomes possible. A skilled therapist might help you see patterns you've been blind to, recognize defenses you weren't aware you were using, understand how your past shapes your present in ways you hadn't noticed. But therapy is expensive, time-consuming, and not available to everyone. Even when it's available, it requires finding a therapist with whom you can establish the right kind of relationship, which is itself partly a matter of luck. The fifth insight is that accepting limits to self-knowledge can be liberating rather than depressing. If you must know yourself completely to be acceptable, you'll always fall short. But if you can accept that complete self-knowledge is impossible for everyone, that mystery is built into the structure of consciousness, that even your limitations are shared across humanity, then you can be easier on yourself. You're allowed to be inconsistent, contradictory, surprising. You're allowed to not have everything figured out. You're allowed to change in ways that mean your past self was partly wrong about who you'd become. This acceptance doesn't mean giving up the pursuit of self-understanding. It means pursuing it differently, with more patience and less anxiety, with more curiosity and less judgment. It means treating yourself as you might treat a close friend, with genuine interest in who they are, but without demanding they be simple or consistent or fully transparent. You can work toward better self-knowledge while accepting that perfect self-knowledge will never arrive. The final insight is that living authentically doesn't require complete self-knowledge. You can live a meaningful, examined, intentional life without understanding yourself perfectly. Authenticity is not about achieving perfect self-transparency and then living in accordance with what you find. It's about engaging with the ongoing process of self-examination, remaining open to what you discover, trying to align your actions with your values, even when those values aren't perfectly clear, accepting responsibility for who you're becoming, even though you can't control it completely. Authenticity in this sense is compatible with uncertainty. You make choices based on your current understanding, knowing that understanding is incomplete and might be revised. You commit to projects and relationships even though you can't be certain they reflect your true self, whatever that would mean. You take responsibility for your actions even when you don't fully understand your motivations. You live forward even while understanding backward remains murky and incomplete. The paradox of self-knowledge, then, is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be lived with. You pursue self-understanding knowing you'll never achieve complete self-understanding. You examine yourself carefully, knowing your examination is flawed and limited. You seek authenticity knowing authentic selfhood is partly a mystery. You take responsibility for yourself knowing you don't fully know the self you're responsible for. These aren't contradictions to be resolved, but tensions to be balanced, ongoing negotiations rather than final settlements. As consciousness dissolves into sleep, as the boundaries of self become porous and permeable, you practice this acceptance nightly. The self that seems so solid during waking hours loosens its grip, reveals its constructed nature, shows its fundamental instability, and yet tomorrow you will reassemble it, gather the scattered pieces back into coherent form, resume the project of being someone. This daily cycle of construction and dissolution might be the deepest teacher about the nature of self. You are both real and illusory, both knowable and mysterious, both process and pattern, both substance and story. Learning to live well with these paradoxes, learning to hold them without needing to resolve them. This might be as close to wisdom as human beings can come. The quest for self-knowledge continues not because it can be completed, but because the quest itself is part of what makes us human, part of what makes consciousness the strange, recursive, beautiful impossibility that it is. Tomorrow you will wake and ask again, who am I? And the question will remain, as it has for millennia, both unanswerable and unavoidable, both frustrating and essential, both our deepest challenge and our greatest gift. Thank you for joining me on this philosophical journey through the paradox of knowing yourself completely. If these ideas resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more explorations of timeless wisdom. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments about your own experiences with self-knowledge and the mystery of consciousness. Until next time, rest well in the gentle embrace of these ancient questions.